So I'm going to give a quick introduction to everybody as to who Gavin is. So Gavin's an open data scientist and lead consultant and economist with a company called Whitehawk, which is he's the major shareholder. He specializes in open data consulting in public health, economic development, and data curation. He has spent more than a decade in economic and business development initiatives in South Africa before moving to Europe over 10 years ago. He now works across different governments, particularly with the UK government, and we were very interested in discussing the subject today because all of us can see, I mean, all of us are doing it now, I think, or most of us, how the new home working culture has changed the way that we're working, how the COVID pandemic has accelerated the move away from office working to perhaps more remote working. And we're very interested to know what the data is around that. Is that phenomenon something that precedes the COVID epidemic? Is the COVID epidemic accelerating that phenomenon, and what impacts that will have on the general economy, on real estate, where people live, where people choose to do business, and all those kinds of things.
So absolutely delighted to welcome Gavin today for perhaps our most topical event to date. So we started planning it back in July, and perhaps we thought that things were starting to improve then. So it was near the end of what we now probably call the first wave. The world seemed to be opening up again. Some people were attempting to do summer holidays. Both the French and the UK governments were encouraging workers to actually return to the office. But here we are, 4 months later, both nations back in lockdown. So yeah, there seems no better place to start, Gavin, than to ask you the question that I believe most people are wondering, even if they don't actually want to admit it, or maybe they're just scared to ask it. But will the world ever return to what it was pre-COVID? Or is COVID just the great excuse for the changes that we're about to see?
So, a lot of the interesting things around the questions that have been asked during the whole COVID period has been looking at data that we've always had, but we've never really studied to this level. I mean, if you think about the common cold, it hasn't been studied at this scale before. So you've had small research labs, you've had researchers who may have an insight, but you've never had a level of integration globally around a particular disease that we currently have. We've never had the capacity for it, okay? We've got, 2 verging on 3 vaccines that have come out in just 8 months. So we're talking an acceleration of process, really good connections, but this didn't come out of nowhere. A lot of people have been building the foundations for this for a very long time. So the same goes when we start looking at some of the economic impacts. There are trends and patterns that have been moving for a very long time. Changes in the way of workplace behaviors, changes in what is possible and what people have been wanting to do. Zoom that we're on didn't, suddenly get invented just in time for COVID. It's been around for years. Everything has been around looking for opportunities. So when you look at things like changes in office supply, which is one of those things, what's going to happen to the high street? What's going to happen to city centers? Will people go back to work? And people go, well, maybe we won't go back to work. But we've been pushing people away from offices for a very long time. If you think about management fads over the last 10 years, you've seen things like moving to soft offices, partitions, and more recently hot desking. And when UK government asked me to have a look at just kind of recent trends of data, and then asked me to just run it back to 2010, I mean, we have the data, just no one's looked. And you can see over the last 10 years, office sizes, individual offices have reduced in size 20%. And it's been continuous. There's no big leap where it suddenly changed. It's just gradually declining for a decade. So what we're likely to see is, as some of these impacts are realized, as we start to go, hey, this is different, then businesses will turn around, company directors will turn around and say, oh yes, it's COVID, it's the change, okay? But all they're really doing is justifying decisions that have been made over the last few decades. And these decisions are very specific. Office rents have gone up. The cost of having people in city centers is high. And so you increase the density of the people in your office. You can call it the green revolution if you like. It's not very different from adding fertilizer on a farm. You pack more in closer. So within an office environment, that's pretty common. For those of you who've been working in offices for decades, have probably realized you have less space. But incrementally from year to year, you may not notice when that actually happened. The thing is, that has consequences. When you send 100 people in one office home, then that's a much greater density. That means that the amount of people living near the office decreases. So even if your apartment is small in a city center, the density of urban living is still lower than office space that people are using. So if 100 people go home, they're not going home nearby. They're going home to the periphery of the city. And that means that not only has 10 years of increasing density in the city center in offices decreased the amount of space that offices are using, relatively speaking, even as the amount of offices have gone up, more tall buildings. But that coincides with that dependency on ground level for all the restaurants and shops and retailers for all those people upstairs. So those things start intersecting. If you're sending 10% of your workforce home, then it's a little bit like airlines, where if there's 100 seats on a plane, the airline only makes money once the 95th person works on board. But if 6 people stay home, that plane's running at a loss, even with 94 people on it, okay? So these numbers are subtle. Cities may not, once we recover, may not look that much less occupied than they were before, but businesses are struggling because the margins are so fine.
Yeah.
And so that's where you're going to start seeing change. So it's really hard to predict, to say, this particular company will win, this particular company will lose. Right now, we've seen that the winners are the internet-based companies. Landlords, obviously, if you own an office building, you might see a decline in tenancy, but offices themselves, companies that work from offices, will adjust. They'll in all likelihood be fine. The real challenge, though, is going to be for retailers, because it's very difficult for a retailer to adjust the retail space that they have on offer. The big change over the last 10 years has been just-in-time distribution. Retailers have gone from having a storeroom on the premises to using that storeroom for retail space. And a truck arrives every morning with everything they need to sell. And that truck is arriving all day long, which is why there's all these trucks coming in and out of cities all the time. So from a retail perspective, you're stuck with the retail space you have. You can't lop off the back of the building and rent it to somebody else because it's unrentable. The rental space you're used to, narrow building, long, deep, it makes it harder. For the sort of independent shops that we've seen, that have really benefited from high density city centers, they're going to struggle. But kind of depends on different business cultures. In the UK, it's the big groups that tend to lop off entire areas of retail when they feel under pressure, and it's the independents that hang in there. And that sort of means that maybe the independents have an opportunity to renegotiate rents and to maybe take advantage of these changes. But as I say, it's difficult to know. These are long-term trends that have been going on for some time, and we are definitely seeing COVID as the catalyst.
Yeah. So, like you say, these are things that were already existing anyway, and it is just catalyzed by COVID. But if that's the case, in what ways have people's needs changed?
I think our needs are still the same. I think our appetite for risk is probably lower. While there are certainly people who are anti-mask and conspiracy theorists, those are the same people that were always anti-whatever and conspiracy theorists, and their needs haven't really changed. But the average member of the public is probably more wary of being out in a public place right now, not through any direct sense of danger, but through a sort of the risk that we're all aware of now. We don't know where the disease is. We don't know who's sick. We don't know what's going on. And we're also probably more fundamentally aware of illness. From a European or American perspective, we have kind of missed out on general disease trends, SARS, MERS, Ebola. It's not like the world does not see on an annual basis some major disease breakout somewhere. Okay, Europeans have been lucky, and Americans have been lucky, and that has led to a false sense of security that somehow you're untouchable, that somehow your healthcare systems are better than in Africa or in Asia. And that's not necessarily true. They're all scaled to a particular need, and once that need rises beyond a certain point, you can't reach it. So from an individual perspective, we're shopping more online. Distribution companies have done well. Amazon has done well. Ocado has done well. And so we're seeing those sorts of changing patterns. We may see an acceleration in terms of the way government engages with the public. The UK government's reasonably good about putting things online so that people can interact with the state online. But most European countries are still got a long way to go in terms of building that sort of capacity. You don't necessarily want to expose your own staff, let alone members of the public, to forced queuing for whatever government services there are. So, shifting things to more autonomous, more online-based services is likely to accelerate. But again, none of these are new. It's not like these were not on government roadmaps, until the beginning of this year. There will be, there's things I can say I will hope. I hope that government will recognize the real infrastructure requirements in a state. Healthcare is a real infrastructure requirement, which in some cases has been taken for granted. But just as true is, garbage collection, distribution of, mail, all of these sorts of things which weren't that highly prioritized, kind of assumed that, they weren't really necessary in a modern state anymore to worry about, have become highly contentious. If you think about it, we're monitoring COVID spread by monitoring sewage output. We can see that several weeks in advance. So there's a lot more monitoring we can do and a lot more scientific stuff that we can do. One comment I had with a friend was that, look what we did in 8 months for COVID. Imagine what would happen if we put our minds to it on global warming.
Yeah, completely.
So, we've learned that problems are soluble, and that the real challenge is, accepting that the scientific method is a meaningful thing to do. One other thing, obviously, is in supply chains. They've been wrecked. Just-in-time supply chains, when borders close, has turned out to be very, very, very unstable, very, very tenuous. From a Brexit perspective, it may be an early warning for people about just what it means within a European border, what happens when a border seizes up. When you've moved to just-in-time delivery for the last decade, from retail to manufacturing, and suddenly ships aren't traveling, quarantine means the ship can't dock, all sorts of things like that, then the likelihood is we might see manufacturers start to onshore some of their crucial supply chain. So I do expect that we might see review of that. I'm not sure there's going to be a stampede, but I certainly think that people are going to be having a look and trying to figure out, how risky was this? Did we recover? Were things put in place at this stage, 8 months later, to mitigate this? I certainly noticed in the second lockdown that there was less disruption in the supply chain than there was in the first lockdown.
Yeah, fair enough. In the article that you wrote back in July for The Guardian, you actually spoke about now being the time to invest and fund business mobility, so as not to actually squander the moment we've been presented with. You can always make some.
Sure, there are winners and losers. If you think about it, when we say that 100 people in an office stay home, home didn't have very much before because there wasn't a need for as much supply during the day. So a lot of the places that people commute from didn't necessarily have, interesting restaurants or lunch spots or, coffee shops or things like that. So there's an opportunity for people to relook at how their neighborhoods might have changed. And also, for many people, going home from the office was respite. You didn't want to have people around, so your little home island was your little home island. But if you're now working from home permanently, you'll probably have a desire to get out of the house every now and then, just to go out, just to meet some other people. Otherwise, you're not meeting anybody. I've been working from home for, in various forms for 25 years, and I can tell you that, I deliberately live close to the city center, so that I can get out of the house and go for a cup of coffee and see another human being, because otherwise I don't have any real interaction for days on end.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're definitely going to see behavioral change, and that has a likely implication on where you live right now. And if you look around where you live, chances are that there aren't that many places in comparison to where you work. So we'll see a sort of redistribution, but it's not a like for like. Remember that if you've got 10,000 people working in a particular set of office buildings right on top of each other, then you've got really big, interesting range of places to eat and places to go in the immediate vicinity. When they go home, that's 100 people here, it's 20 people here, it's another 15 people over there. That doesn't support that degree of complexity. Okay. So you will see change. And look at the changes over the last 10 years as particular communities became essentially dormitory towns. Office buildings that might have existed there have been converted into apartments. Yeah. There isn't any office space. Retail space has probably been scaled down as well. So there may not be physical space available immediately for this sort of transformation. What are your local authorities going to do? What are the opportunities in investment? And there's certainly people looking into the data that I've got to try and figure out where do we invest and where do we put places. Yeah. But a lot of that has started off with a fear of we're losing buildings rather than, oh, actually people are moving somewhere. They didn't just disappear.
Yeah, and well, from that data and kind of what we've learned so far through this, what do you think the policy response should actually be?
Policy response, we've already had local authorities declaring bankruptcy from, suspension of rates payments, businesses essentially shut down. So the policy response, policy is always a lagging factor. And it always lags what people are actually going to do. For the moment, it's going to be very difficult for government to respond when there's so many things to fight at the same time. And at local government level, capacity constraints have been hollowed out for years with lower funding. I think, challenges are going to be change of use for changing what buildings are currently allowed to do and what they might become. If manufacturing is starting to move, there's also got to be a recognition of how much new factories have changed in comparison to what they looked 10 years ago. A small manufacturing plant arrives in a kit, you unpack it, it's delivered in a container. So what plants look like, what offices look like, what retail looks like when you're building it from scratch now is very different from what it would have been 10 years ago. And from a local authority, because it's going to be at the local authority level rather than national government level, there's going to need to be a lot of recreation of skills. If there's going to be manufacturing coming back into the suburbs, then the likelihood is that local authority may not have anybody that knows anything about the requirements or needs for it. There's also going to need to be a recognition that changes distribution of electricity, it changes distribution of water supply, it changes sanitation, pressure. This is challenging from an infrastructure perspective because all supply, all the requirement has been channeled into hubs. And we're now distributing out. So, I would say that it's difficult to say, policy must change in the following ways. I think there's just going to have to be a lot of give and take for the next couple of years while this rebalances, but it will rebalance. And in some cases, you probably find that it may be less than you expect because it's already happened.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So what about perhaps the role institutions are playing in that as well, and what some of the banks have come out and said, and things around that? Is it all going to be based purely on government and local authority, or are there going to be other factors that weigh into that?
Well, I mean, we also need to be careful of who owns the narrative. Right now, government is sort of owning the narrative, but we're already seeing a range of major corporate actors trying to take control of that narrative. Deutsche Bank publishing this paper saying, "Oh, us home workers must now pay extra taxes." We're not gaining from what's going on here. If anything, we're under more pressure. We're having to do more in a home that was never designed for working from home. We're having to allocate space that we didn't have to allocate before. We're putting more pressure on devices at home. I mean, you've probably never made as much coffee and tea at home as you have over the last 6 months, which means you're probably sitting there thinking, well, maybe I should get a better quality kettle. So you're definitely not winning, okay? But the narrative, you don't control it. The big landlords, the big investors are controlling it, and they're basically saying, hey, how do we make more money out of this situation? I sure as hell don't want to pay more tax. So let's pass it on to the office worker again, because clearly it's their fault. So we need to be aware of that, and where possible, we need to push back. It would be outrageous if the consequence of having to work from home, of having to bear the cost of that, becomes, oh, by the way, pay more tax as well.
Yeah, I guess opportunism is rife, but it always has been through any period of crisis in history.
The other interesting thing I saw over the weekend was like Paris's rental prices have actually gone up.
Yeah.
Which, the expectation was, well, oh, it'll be cheaper to live in cities. Nobody will want to live there anymore. Now, why is that happening? Speculation, maybe. People who can taking advantage of the lower pricing now to try and get in ahead on the expectation that things will change and people come back in. The reality is, if you didn't have money before this, you don't have money now. There's very little you can do to take advantage of any opportunities that are coming along. But that doesn't mean that the usual suspects are not taking advantage of the opportunities that come along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the situation is constantly evolving. And like we said, when we first looked at this back in July, our outlook was probably very different then. If we were to do this again in April, we'd have something completely different to say, and then July again. So with this, constant changing, what do we still need to know? What do we need to find out? And then perhaps what will people claim or businesses claim that might work in their favor?
So, we've seen the management consultants also popping up at the moment, with reports saying this is happening or this will happen. My feeling is that the data are too slow moving to be able to tell you exactly what has happened. And if you've walked down around a lockdown high street, how do you know whether those shops are never going to reopen or whether they're just shut at the moment because they have to be? Mm-hmm. And yet there are reports coming out that 60% of shops will not reopen, or that productivity from working at home has gone up, or something like that. It's impossible to know. This is just selection bias in sampling right now. If I'm sampling active businesses, the businesses that have continued to remain active through lockdown are ones that would have been efficient to start with, that would have been geared up to be as effective as possible no matter the circumstances. So if those are the only ones currently running, then on average, yes, businesses are more efficient now than they were before, because we're not including the old ones that are essentially just in a holding pattern. And the same goes for retail. It's impossible to know right now who might reopen or might not reopen. Many businesses would have said, what's the point of being open right now on 20% use? I might as well just stay home and do something else. But they still intend to reopen. So, there are certainly a lot of claims And I'd be nervous about worrying about anyone. I wouldn't say respond to those claims. If there are things that you can do right now that are working for you, that you have adjusted to, be they teleconferencing, be they changing to online delivery, to whatever might work for you, that's cool. But don't make any major hard and fast changes right now just because you think, somebody wrote an interesting article in a newspaper, or some major consulting company said that this is the future of work. I think that we really do need to kind of let it happen. I mean, it's a lost year for a lot of people. It's a disaster for kids, particularly, wealthier parents have certainly been able to afford online tutorials, online training, home teaching and things like that. But for poorer parents, particularly for first generation parents who may not have major educations themselves, it's been a tragedy, and it will be a continuing tragedy because a lost year just cascades. So, the stuff we need to know is going to be, in the short term, is to accept that we have at least another year of sustained periodic lockdowns, because vaccinating 7 billion people is not something that happens overnight. Okay, it's going to be an incredibly slow and frustrating process to watch, because it's going to be like, well, Amazon delivers on 24 hours. Why can't I get a vaccine on 24 hours? It simply is how do you produce that much from a standing start? We're talking about 1 billion vaccines available by midway next year. Great. That's just over 10% of the requirement. So we don't know how long that's really going to take. We don't know how well governments are going to hold up. We're seeing a lot of fatigue. And when populations at the population level get fatigued, get tired of staying home, you get tired of seeing the same people day in and day out with no room and no space, then that becomes something that people start to project onto others. So you start to get angry, it's the government's fault, or it's your neighbor's fault, or it's the immigrant's fault. So I would say in some respects it's going to be relatively chaotic. We should kind of expect more of the same in some respects. We've certainly seen bad behaviors from society, and I don't think that's going to suddenly magically change just because we have a vaccine or because we're allowed out of our houses. This, to some extent, is, and to put it in context, try and remember that the Second World War was 6 years long. So the period that we're going, and for many countries, the Second World War was a short period. It was an incredibly intense short period. And for many countries in the world at the moment, this is equivalent in terms of the impact at a population level. Okay, it's not obviously destructive in terms of buildings falling down, but in terms of population death, I mean, 250,000 dead Americans, 40,000, 50,000 dead Brits, dead French people, 25,000 dead Germans. The knock-on effects onto families, the knock-on effects to the interactions you have with other people are enormous. So in some ways, this is the equivalent of a population level of event of a world war. Yeah. And so if you look at what happened post that war, massive reconstruction, but also massive changes to institutions. The current UN is a product of that. And the likelihood is we will see major institutional redevelopment around public health. There has to be a recognition that these sorts of diseases are perpetual, and that a city with public transport, mass transportation around the world is very conducive to the spread of disease very easily. So, what happens to tourism when people are nervous to fly? What happens? And tourism's, for many, it's like 10% of the world economy. It's enormous and it's dead. What happens to, just at an institutional level? how do you organize a society where people might be less prepared to travel than they were before? When many people have felt maybe abandoned or betrayed by everybody else. There are some countries that have said, well, let's just let all the old people die. For anyone who's currently over the age of 65 and expecting to live another 20 or 30 years, that is quite a betrayal. So we don't know a lot of stuff. And there will obviously be good things that come out of this as well. I mean, we have actually shown that public health research can work at scale, at speed. And that has, what this also means is we might see, I'm very involved in data science education. And my great challenge has always been that I would rather the data scientists solve the great challenges of research data, in economics, in inequality, in public health, instead of going to work for Amazon and Facebook to sell crap online in adverts, which is where the majority of data scientists go to work these days, is basically data mining, online activity. So with the profile that has been raised, I mean, think about what we all know. Since January, we've learned how to read an exponential chart. We know about logs. We understand the power law and doubling time. We've learned a great deal in terms of data, and I can only hope that a whole bunch of youngsters looking at the real heroes of this pandemic, nurses and doctors and research scientists and just scientific communicators who have spent a huge amount of effort just to explain what on earth is happening to us, become kind of the new aspirational role models. And if that has a major impact on education, I'll be super thrilled. But so what we still need to know, everything.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of interesting points really do come out of that. And something that worries me is that, like you said, 250,000 Americans dead, and whether it's now reaching a point where people's comprehension of what that means, with, as we know, humans struggle to comprehend large numbers, and suddenly human life is becoming a commodity and being just looked at as another number on another chart, and we're losing sight of perhaps what is really going on. But yeah, anyway, that's
there I'd say is it's very this is an intimate kind of experience for many people, because I mean, if this was a war, you'd bomb a city, and then people in that city would have experienced it, but maybe nobody else would have. Whereas here, people are dying everywhere. This is not something that happens just in one place. There aren't really people who've managed to escape it. I imagine just about everybody on this call knows someone who has had COVID, has maybe been extremely sick, or has maybe died from it. Whereas, you might not have had the same experience with SARS or MERS or Ebola.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you, Gavin. Those are the questions that I had for you, and I'd like to open it up to anyone else. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or raise your hand, and you can ask them yourself.
So I'm going to get the ball rolling by asking a question. I saw some very interesting a couple of very interesting articles this week about how the impact is different in countries with different demographic profiles. So one of the articles I read yesterday was talking about how Africa was impacted differently because the demographics are such in Africa that there are a lot more young people proportional to older people when compared to, for example, Italy, where the older population is significantly higher. So therefore the measures that needed to be taken and the impact economically and socially was significantly higher. Have you had a look at any information around that? Have you got any comments to make around that? Maybe it gives an opportunity for Africa to leap ahead economically, a bit like China is looking to do.
I think there's Asia, for instance, took COVID far more seriously, not because of demographics or because of anything, but because they had SARS. Yeah. They bore the brunt of SARS when it first came out, almost a decade ago, and they put everything in place, and no one had to tell them twice when disease came along. And the same goes for Africa. There's a lot of communicable diseases. You've got malaria, you've got HIV. They have just yesterday announced that they've finally knocked off Ebola, that the last wild spread of Ebola had been contained, and they finally ended that epidemic. So again, you have an entire population, a continent, where when you say to people, this is a highly communicable disease and people die, people go, yes, I agree, that's dangerous, let's do something about it. Whereas in Europe, when was the last major communicable disease that ended up with thousands of people dead? 100 years ago.
Yep.
So, and the same goes for the US. So we've ducked bullets for a century, and that has led to a certain response. So certainly demography has had an effect, but at this point in time, I think there's so many different variables. We look at the physical layout of cities, public transport, distancing works, but if your work life, if the type of job that you have doesn't permit distancing, so if there's a large amount of close proximity poverty, then you may have greater difficulties distancing. So right now to say, oh, it's just because of demography or it's just because of this, I think it's multidimensional. Nothing I've seen has given an equivocal answer as to who escaped and who didn't. I mean, if you look at Europe, it's taken it seriously. It's done things that were right, but it's actually at the moment worse off than the US, which has essentially said, let's do everything wrong. But physically, the physical structure of the geography of a city in America is very different from the geography of the city in Europe. Cities in Europe tend to be much denser. Distancing is much harder in a highly dense city with very great proximity of people living close together. So even with distancing, you're still going to get infection. Whereas in America, big houses, urban sprawl, if you actually took steps, you'd probably be able to ease the burden quite easily. Whereas if you don't, then, so I'm not convinced about just the pure demography play. Even in Europe, younger cities have experienced outbreaks as badly as older cities. Again, this is one of those things where we don't know. It's going to take a long time for this data to come out. You can certainly expect that more than a year from now, we will start to see some of these reports and research analysis coming out. There's a question in chat around the Great Reset. Could you define what that means? What is the Great Reset as a definition?
I think Alex is referring to the change in the way the world economy is organized away from a dollar-dominated system towards a multipolar economic system. Is that right, Alex?
I don't think COVID's going to have any impact on that. I mean, other than the gradual shift. I mean, I'm not an expert on that at all. It's got not much to do with the type of work I do. What I have read will be pretty much the same as what you're able to read on that. My only view on it is that it's not as straightforward to change the currency that you use. It'd be equivalent to changing the side of the road you drive on. It's not something that is easy to do gradually, because if your trading partners are still using the other currency, you can't just change on your own. So I think that that we're moving away from a multipolar world. I mean, certainly the lack of international cooperation around COVID has really felt like a tremendous weakness. It could have been dealt with much better than it has been. And the likelihood is that has consequences in other areas of cooperation and collaboration, including currency.